Greetings, everyone. I am Mohammed Tavakkoli, the inaugural director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. I welcome you all to another session of our weekly Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali lecture series, and we are honored to have Dr. Mir-Djalali attending the session today. At the outset, I would like to express our solidarity with the inspiring women's movement in Iran and our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, learn, and teach on their ancestral homeland. I welcome Dr. Rowena Abdul Razak of London School of Economics and Political Science to the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies. Today, Dr. Abdul Razak is speaking on Occupation and Sovereignty, Britain and Iran's Road to the United Nations, 1941-1943. My colleague, Professor Jennifer Jenkins of the University of Toronto, will be introducing our speaker today. Professor Jenkins is currently completing a book manuscript on the Persian question, Germany and Iran in the Age of Empire, 1815 to 1914. Professor Jenkins will be introducing our speaker and will moderate today's session. Professor Jenkins.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Tavakkoli. Thank you to everyone for coming. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Rowena Abdul Razak, who received her DPhil in Oriental Studies from the University of Oxford. Her DPhil explored British policy and attitudes toward the Tudeh Party of Iran during the British-Soviet occupation of the country from 1941 to 1946. Her current research focuses on the transnational connections and links between the British and Iranian left, and she is currently a guest teacher at the London School of Economics. Her title for today, which Professor Tavakkoli mentioned, but I will repeat here, is Occupation and Sovereignty, Britain and Iran's Road to the United Nations, 1941 to 1946. So Dr. Razak, so good to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm really grateful to be here. It's a really wonderful experience, and thank you for the opportunity. Thanks for having me in Toronto, and it's amazing. We were talking about transnational links, and here we are in different parts of the globe: Paris, Berlin, Toronto, London. So it's really nice that we're all here together. Thank you to the internet. But firstly, my heartfelt thanks to Professor Mohammed Tavakkoli Taghi and Professor Jennifer Jenkins for having me here today. And I just have to say thank you for that wonderful introduction, Professor Mohammed Tavakkoli, because just acknowledging where we are, the history of where we stand is really important. So that was very thoughtful. So thank you for that. It's really an honor to present this work as part of the Mir-Djalali lecture series in collaboration with Encyclopaedia Iranica, and to have Professor Mir-Djalali in the room as well is terrifying, as well as a real honor. So I hope I do this paper justice. So I had the opportunity actually to present a version of this paper at this year's Association for Iranian Studies conference. And it's not often that one gets this extra second chance to build on thoughts and comments that came out of that previous presentation. So I'm extra grateful and honored. And I have to say thank you to Professor Jenkins for taking time out of her very, very busy schedule to moderate today's session. I've relied extensively on her work and research over the years and have benefited greatly from her encouragement and support. So thank you so much, Jennifer, truly. If I may, I'm going to share my screen because I have some photos and quotes that I'd like to share while we go along. So bear with me while I do this. I did this earlier. So So this paper comes out of my PhD, where, as Mohammed and Jennifer have already mentioned, I examined the position of the Tudeh Party of Iran in policymaking during the British-Soviet occupation of the country during the Second World War. In my research, I was often confronted by these questions of nationhood, sovereignty, and internationalism, whether in the context of the invasion itself, the military occupation, the war, the multinational anti-fascist campaign in Iran and other parts of the world, or when it came to political expression in the country itself. The invasion of neutral Iran was a strategic necessity to secure resources and to break Axis presence in the Middle East. This was a theme that would be returned to time and time again throughout the period, and one that was used to justify the ongoing occupation. Nonetheless, it was a situation that was uncomfortable and had to be reconciled in some way. As I continued my research, these 5 questions emerged. Firstly, how did the British government attempt to reconcile its military occupation of Iran with the war against fascism? Secondly, how did the British government envision an independent Iran in the post-war era? Thirdly, to what extent did this translate into membership to the United Nations? Fourthly, what were the opinions of the British government towards that membership? And finally, how was propaganda used to promote this idea of the United Nations in Iran during a military occupation? These questions act as a running theme throughout today's paper. And while I'm still finding concrete answers, and I may never find them, but I hope they at least provide some understanding regarding the context of the occupation and how this laid the foundations for Iran's early membership to the UN. Such research and work is part of an important movement in scholarship that is highlighting this important era, namely the occupation period in Iran's modern history. The occupation period saw some important developments in Iranian politics and society, from the abdication of Reza Shah, the release of the Marxist Group of 53, the founding of the Tudeh, the burst of political expression to the start of the oil nationalization movement. Plenty of academics from within and beyond the field are interested in the politics of this era, from British historian Peter Jackson and upcoming historian Jack Taylor to familiar names including, arguably Jennifer Jenkins as well, Fakhreddin Azimi, Turash Atabaki, Stephanie Cronin, among others. And they've examined it from the view of the occupying forces themselves, local diplomats, Iranian policymakers, workers, intellectuals, and so on. Work on the United Nations in Iran have so far primarily been examined from a contemporary perspective, especially focusing on sanctions. Some work on Iran at the League of Nations and the Paris Peace Conference have helped provide insight into Iranian governmental embodiment of sovereignty and interaction with international organizations. For this research, I drew extensively from the National Archives at Kew Gardens, as well as the University of Manchester's Digital Archives of Iranian Newspapers, which is a wonderful resource if any of you are interested in Iranian newspapers. And I also relied on governmental correspondence as well as amazing propaganda material that I hope to share with you today. Born out of the failure of the League of Nations, the United Nations was established to safeguard the ideals of the Atlantic Charter. Drawn by US President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, they set out several goals of the post-war world, including territorial integrity, self-determination, self-government, reduction of trade restrictions, and global cooperation. Signed before the Japanese invasion of Pearl Harbor, the bilateral agreement stated US support for Britain in the war. A month after, it was adopted by the Soviet Union and other European governments in exile. In January 1942, the Allied Big Four, the US, Britain, the Soviet Union, and China, signed the United Nations Declaration, an earnest document that stood for international integrity. A day later, other countries joined, including the South American nations of Costa Rica, Cuba, Haiti, and so on. Intended as an international organization against fascism, it also stood against imperialism and reinforced the importance of peace among nations and national independence. For the British Empire, this posed some uncomfortable truths, namely fighting for freedom while still being an imperial power. Furthermore, it relied on money, resources, and manpower from its colonies to fight its war against the Axis forces. For example, when Malaya and Singapore fell to the Japanese army in 1942, it was not only a strategic defeat, but one that really hit and damaged its imperial prestige. In India, the Indian nationalist movement mostly supported the war, but there were those such as the nationalist leader Subhas Chandra Bose, who went to Tokyo and formed the Indian National Army to fight the British. In the Middle East, Palestine, Iraq, Egypt, and the Gulf states were subject to British imperial design and homed British headquarters during the war. The campaign in North Africa against German tank forces, for example, were fought hard to protect the Middle East and British presence there. And indeed, the occupation of Iran placed Britain within this very conundrum: how to reconcile the invasion and occupation of a neutral sovereign country with the noble idea of freeing the world from fascism and still being an imperial power. As this paper, I hope, will show, part of the solution lay within the support and encouragement of Iran's membership to the United Nations as a way to mitigate the hardships caused by British and Soviet troop presence and to justify the ongoing military occupation. Regarded and portrayed as a vital member of the alliance, it paved the country's position as a nation among nations, bringing it to the forefront of international affairs, which would allow Iran to enter the post-war world on a positive footing and a position from which Iran would navigate its international affairs. It cannot be ignored that concurrent to the ideals of the early UN was the contradiction of war. In August 1941, Britain and the Soviet Union jointly invaded Iran. When war was declared in Europe, Reza Shah Pahlavi declared Iran's neutrality, maintaining diplomatic relations with both Allied and Axis nations. Under the pretext of Tehran's closeness with Nazi Germany, Britain and the Soviet Union launched a military campaign to occupy the country. In a matter of a few short weeks, the Iranian army surrendered. Tehran was surrounded, Reza Shah abdicated, and his son Mohammad Reza was declared Shah. While Axis presence was an important factor behind the invasion, indeed German economic and political interests in Iran was substantial. It was access to Iranian resources, namely oil, wheat, and its transport links between the Caspian Sea and the Persian Gulf that was a compelling reason, allowing for Soviet troops to be supplied and ensuring easy access to the oil. With the war at the forefront of their interests, Britain and the Soviet Union divided the country between them. The Soviets gained control of the north, while the oil fields of Abadan in the south of the country came under British jurisdiction. Already under the control of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and effectively the British government, who was its largest shareholder, oil was symbolic of London's presence and control in the country. With the occupation came an expansion of British influence over Iran. Consulates were reopened and networks expanded throughout the south. Although a treaty was signed between the occupying forces and the Iranian government, guaranteeing Iranian autonomy and neutrality, the country was very much under foreign design and jurisdiction. Even the Majlis elections held during this period were subject to what the Allies wanted in candidates, whether they were friendly to the British or the Soviets and in their respective zones. So how did Britain and the other allies, the USSR and the US, reconcile this contradiction? Fighting fascism and declaring universal ideals of peace and order on one hand, and depriving Iranians of their own resources and sovereignty on the other. I try to understand this irony within the context of the UN. A bridge between two opposing realities, Iran was portrayed as a key source for victory, but also a subjugated nation. Our understanding of Iran's historical association with the UN is very much linked to the Azerbaijan crisis, one of the earliest Security Council matters and Cold War-infused confrontations. And since the Islamic Republic, of course, the UN has played a major role in Iran's affairs, from the war with Iraq to sanctions and even to the current protests happening now. And just to echo what Professor Tavakkoli said, my deep solidarity for the brave women of Iran who are fighting on the streets right now. But as we know, Iran's association with the UN predates all of this. The importance of its oil and resources aside, Iran was regarded as essential to the war effort and the international anti-fascist movement. It showcased and stood for Allied unity with the physical presence of British, Soviet, and later American troops working together in a country that had substantial German presence and fascist influence, whose defeat in the eyes of Iranians was an important example of anti-fascism at work, much on the same scale as the propaganda and resistance campaigns run in occupied Europe. There's also a question of Iranian agency in its international affairs. As an occupied nation, it was difficult for Iranian politicians to exercise the country's sovereign rights, whether that meant managing its international relations, its distribution of local resources, or its economy. While a national government existed, with elections and the continued opening of parliament, it was still chaotic, with new prime ministers appointed frequently during the occupation years. Moreover, monetary policy was in the hands of the British and Soviets, who purposely devalued the Iranian currency to make products cheaper, resulting in high inflation and further hardships for the ordinary Iranian citizen. Foreign relations, furthermore, were hard to conduct and subject to Allied policy. And hampered by concerns regarding British imperial designs as well as Soviet post-war ambitions, it has also already been established that the US came to take on an important position as patron and protector at this point. And it took on the role of a balancer, trying to mitigate Iranian sovereignty and excesses of the occupying forces, but still was seen as the lesser player in occupied Iran. These themes and contexts help us to understand how the occupation played an important role in Iran's early membership to the UN. It was already a member of the League of Nations, and while it may seem natural for it to continue its membership to another supreme intranational organization, it is still vital to understand the context of the war and how the occupation made it necessary and important for Iran's membership. For example, ongoing research by Philip Grobin at the University of St. Andrews, drawing on existing scholarship by Tudeh Party, has looked at the historical role played by Iran on the international stage, especially when it came to voicing what it needed, such as the 1919 Peace Conference in Paris. Grobin stipulated how Iran's assertion of its sovereignty was much on display during this era, conflicting in particular with British imperial design. Much can be drawn from this with how Iran entered into the international stage after World War II, and how sovereignty was a key concept for Iran to assert its needs and wants on a global stage. But for today, of course, I'm really just focusing on the early years of Iran's interactions with the United Nations, or rather more accurately, because we're looking at the early 40s, its concept, as we are concerned here with the years before its formal foundation. The military occupation, propaganda, and the promise of equal nationhood within an internationalist framework. In this work, I've also been drawing from political scientists like Glenda Slugger and Patricia Clavin, who posited the fundamental tension that sets the realism of the national against the idealism of the international community, a situation that is clearly demonstrated in occupied Iran and its relations, or rather subjugation, to the other Allied members. After years of being militarily occupied, Iran emerged at the end of the war alongside 50 other nations to become a founding member of the United Nations in 1945. And while Iran was also one of the first international crises to be brought to the United Nations, I'll go into it a little bit, but just to give some background, the continued occupation of Azerbaijan and Kurdistan by Soviet troops in 1945 to 46, it was left to the United Nations Security Council to seek a resolution. And in that case, there was a lot of pressure to reach a favorable solution towards Iran, to show that the Security Council and the UN was a functioning body in international disputes, and to ensure that the terms of Iran's military occupation would be honored. Indeed, the US and to some extent Britain at this point was anxious to demonstrate that Iran would not be suddenly reduced to the status of a satellite. But these international tensions were already brewing even before. The British and Soviet occupation of Iran, meant to be a showcase of cooperation, partnership, and anti-fascism, was an unnatural and tense situation. Both were wary of the other and suspected that they were pursuing their own designs, whether it was the promotion of British-style parliamentarism or the encouragement of local Marxist parties. For nearly 4 years, the occupation brought the difficulties, shortages, and pressures of the war to Iran. with British and Soviet troops directing Iranian oil, wheat, and infrastructure towards the war effort. Ordinary Iranians were deliberately sidelined, leading to scarcities and discontent. The Iranian government under Prime Minister Mohammad Ali Farouqi, for example, was caught between filling the void left by the authoritarian leader Reza Shah and managing the needs of the occupying forces as per their treaty. They were obliged to relinquish substantial control of the country's economy and access to its vital resources. Indeed, the occupying forces deliberately placed their needs above Iranians, leading to starvation and deprivation. As already mentioned at the start of this paper, and something that I will come back to again and again, the occupation placed the Allied forces in an uncomfortable and awkward position, liberating the world from fascism and depriving a sovereign nation of its resources and freedom. Sovereignty is an important right of nations, which would be later enshrined in the UN Charter. It was in theory meant to be protected in the tripartite treaty alliance signed by the newly crowned Mohammad Reza Shah, the British and the Soviets in January 1942. Already a violation of previous premises to respect Iran's territorial integrity, it stipulated that the occupation would not be permanent and would only last as long as the war. This in place, however, did not prevent the subjugation of Iran and its people to the will and needs of the Allies. As noted by Abbas Amanat, the invasion was reminiscent of the Anglo-Russian alliance during the Great War. Subjected to British imperial designs since the 19th century, whether it was in battle for territory, caught between British and Russian imperialism, or oil and other national resources, Iran had long been in a battle for its sovereignty and independence. Proud of the fact it was never formally colonized like the majority of India, it was still exposed to imperial ambitions and concerns. Since his ascension to the Peacock throne, Reza Shah's reign oversaw some serious reversals of British imperial presence, the renegotiation of terms with the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the closing of consulates in provinces, and the reduction of British influence among the tribes. While his domestic policy saw the strengthening of central power, the suppression of opposition and political freedom, Reza Shah made an important stand against British imperialist presence. The occupation, however, saw a further reversal of this and threatened Iran's hard-earned sovereignty, especially in the face of historical British imperial designs. In the case of the Soviet Union, Soviet troops in the north represented a revival of Russian imperialism and constituted a real concern for Iranian independence. The outbreak of the Second World War revealed the failure of the League of Nations to contain belligerent nations. Much of the League's shortcomings were chalked up to the United States' refusal to join in. Excuse me, I've just lost my page slightly. So much of the League's shortcomings were chalked up to the United Nations' refusal to join and its lack of proper mechanisms to enforce peace. Furthermore, the organization was steeped in irony, for as much as Woodrow Wilson's vision guaranteed sovereign rights for certain nations, this did not apply to those still under the yoke of the British, French, Dutch, or American empires. For any international organization to work, it needed to face these hard and uncomfortable truths. The non-participation of the US in the League of Nations also made it difficult to implement truly international and far-reaching legislation. At the time of the occupation of Iran, the US was not involved in the war and had not provided any troops, true to its isolationist policy. Although they did pledge support and aid to the Allies, it was only the attack on Pearl Harbor that the US became militarily involved, including in occupied Iran. For Iran, this marked the start of one of its most important foreign relationships. In the years of the occupation, the US initially played a minimal political role, aiding and supporting the British and the Soviets logistically. However, their presence quickly took on the position of mediator between the powers, as I've already mentioned, and it tried to advise caution and balance while ensuring Iranian sovereignty was protected. The US's unique in-between position was not lost in Washington, and the importance of the Atlantic Charter and the United Nations was particularly significant in their policy towards Iran. The US Office of War Information noted, and I have a little quote here, the Atlantic Charter is gradually assuming greater significance among the Iranians, whose government, although not yet one of the United Nations, has endorsed its principles. Mention of the charter raises hopes in their hearts. They cling to it as a buckler to shield them against their two great anxieties, British imperialism and Russian communism. Championing its principles by word and deed is sure to help our case and that of our allies. Here, interestingly, the Americans saw that membership to an international community or cause meant liberation from the imperial ambitions of the British and the Russians, not solely from fascist influence. And here is a fantastic poster of Britain and the Soviets joining hands of the Middle East as to show that kind of cooperation. But these were the two anxieties that were, from the Americans' point of view, and they were not wrong, that Iran was facing. And this had been haunting them since the 19th century with the Great Game, the Anglo-Russian Treaty of 1907. The occupation was a present reminder of foreign political designs on Iran. The arrival of the Americans thus helped to mitigate this concern, which was further enforced by their promise to be part of the Atlantic Charter and later the UN. In a concerted effort between the British Ministry of Information, the American Office of War Information, a plan about how to coordinate was drawn up. They tried to take advantage of, here's another fantastic quote I got, of the usual American assumption that everyone in the Near East loves them because they are so disinterested as compared with the dreadful imperialist British. This was something that even the British acknowledged and realized that the Americans could play a much more important part in the propaganda machine as well, and to push this idea of Iranian membership. And it certainly speaks to awareness of how Britain was viewed in Iran, but policy was directed to manage this anxiety, but always within the limitations of the occupation. True and genuine self-reflection was out of the question. Policy was therefore directed towards the promise of freer governance as long as it was friendly towards the occupying forces. For example, one of the first policies implemented by Britain and the Soviet Union was the release of political prisoners. At the same time, however, they also arrested prominent Iranian politicians deemed to be pro-German. So it was a very contradictory policy that they followed. For Iran, these years did see a burst of political freedom and expression symbolized by the establishment of the left-wing Tudeh Party, among other political associations. The Atlantic Charter and the alliance thus became useful tools to persuade Iran that they were part of a noble and righteous cause and that the occupation was a positive event for Iran, with allowance for political expression and representation. Within Allied narrative, this was a palpable and powerful justification for the occupation, which was further enforced by the power of unity. Iran was thus an important example of a nation freed from fascism and therefore played an important role in the psyche of the Allies during the occupation. This notion encouraged and inspired throughout. And I think here's another poster of this idea that, we're all united and the victory of Britain and the Allies was due to the unity of nations and its cause to strive for freedom. Such posters only reinforced the belief in this cause. Of course, propaganda at this point was also directed against German presence and influence, which was still considered to be substantial. And indeed, this was noticeable in Persian newspapers, including Irani Bastan, an illustrated periodical which had once displayed Adolf Hitler on its cover. In line with anti-fascist policy in Iran, the most famous of these posters produced by the British Ministry of Information included depictions of scenes from the Shahnameh and quotes from Saadi. I think, unfortunately, I didn't put them on the slides, but they are fantastic pieces of propaganda, which you can find quite easily on Google. But that was only one level of the Allied strategy. The belief that Iran was an equal nation of the alliance was essential, especially among the ruling elite of the country. Such policy was reflective of British occupation strategy, which was to woo all levels of Iranian society, from students to intellectuals to the elite. The most famous example of this was probably the collaboration between Bozorg Alavi, a member of the Tudeh Party Central Committee who was employed in the British Public Relations Bureau. He actively aided in translation and the production of anti-fascist material in Iran, directed towards Iranians and published in Iranian newspapers, including the Tudeh's very own Mardom. Propaganda was therefore essential to persuade, inspire, and cajole. It helped to continue the Allied narrative of its mission rather than occupation in Iran. But how about in terms of concrete terms of membership in Iranian sovereignty, which was still very much suspended during this period? As an organization, the United Nations only came into being after the war, but the term United Nations gained currency during this period. an important allied tool to display a viable alternative to the fascist alliance, seen here, how the United Nations can beat the Axis. So the United Nations became synonymous to the Allies, and this is something that they wanted to encourage and show. Here it's, again, these are all posters that were produced mainly in Cairo, for those of you interested, and they would have been distributed to all parts of the Middle East, but these ones were specifically for Iran. It was used to include other nations outside the Big Four to show that the alliance was not only limited to the US, Britain, USSR, and China, but included others who may not be fighting, but were still no less important, including Iran, who was giving up their resources for the war effort as per the narrative that they wanted to forward. It was thus a useful membership to bind countries against fascism and towards the overall cause of the alliance. Towards Iranians, language was used to ensure the United Nations was synonymous with the Allies and that Iran was very much part of this group, as seen here. This was noted in language used to describe Iranian official documents in its interactions with the Shah, local politicians, and in posters, broadcasts, and news items. As noted already, for the Americans, it was important to present themselves as without any imperial design, especially as a counter to the British and the Soviets. This anti-imperialism notion, enshrined later in the UN Charter, was thus an important method to promise freedom and sovereignty for occupied Iran. It also helped to soothe historical anxieties regarding Soviet and British designs. While they were engaged in activities that reflected their rivalry, when it came to interpersonal relationships and in terms of how they viewed each other, there were very strong attempts to avoid open conflict for the sake of stability. Here's another great picture to show that these three defend Persia's independence on the left. So I think my left would be the British soldier, the Soviet soldier, and then the American in the middle. And these were the kind of posters that were distributed to show that Persian independence was indeed would be defended by these three allied nations, namely the US, the USSR, and Britain. However, this is not to say that Iranians readily accepted this narrative or the occupation. Anti-British propaganda was noted and was readily seen in local newspapers, attributing the shortage of food and oil to British design, pointing the finger at the British ambassador himself, Rida Bullard, and his public relations team, including the well-known Anne Lambton. These posters in local newspapers caused much discomfort among the embassy staff, leading to forced closures of Iranian newspapers deemed anti-British, or at times they went on to pressure local authorities to suspend them. In the early years of the occupation, there was also rioting and protests against the lack of bread and the presence of foreign troops as well. Towards the end of the period, local voices rose against the occupation. Initially, they were subdued, but towards the end, and they focused a lot of their dissatisfaction against British presence. Although there was no serious backlash to the occupying forces and opposition to it was successfully suppressed. Parties like the Tudeh and the later fronts that emerged were careful not to upset the balance of the occupation and worked within the political system in place, including standing for elections. For the allies in Iran, there was still an acute consciousness about Iran's sovereignty, which was often acknowledged, whether in London, Delhi, or within Iran itself. Indeed, these principles of sovereignty, nationhood, and independence were essential for Britain's post-war vision. Sitting uncomfortably at the head of a vast global empire, it seems somewhat ironic that Britain prided itself in involvement in international organizations before the war, from the League of Nations to even Save the Children. The involvement of Britain's extended to non-governmental sectors as well, though it should be mentioned, which saw support from British socialists for anti-colonial movements. Liberating Europe and the world from fascism was depicted as a noble cause, but it was not meant to contradict its imperial reach. Indeed, the liberation of Malaya, for example, from the Japanese did not necessarily mean an end to British rule. And as we will see, initial national unity groups were abandoned after the war, and the British used force to reassert its empire. In the case of Iran, while the continuation of the occupation beyond the war was not a viable option, they were certainly concerned about Soviet influence in the country and remained behind to balance out their presence in Azerbaijan. In the south, they were concerned by the radicalization of oil workers who, under the influence of the Tudeh, staged a strike that challenged British hold over the oil. So it's important to try and reconcile these imperial anxieties with promises of Iranian sovereignty after the war. The infusion of internationalist ideas and the involvement of the British touched on how policy was directed towards Iran, giving allowance for the promise of a better future for Iranians in the international arena. Much of these ideas were diffused as below in materials produced during the occupation to show that Britain was a defender of freedom and was a bastion of democracy. These altruistic messages helped to mitigate the occupation and the hardships of war and calmed imperial anxieties, where British imperial interests could be protected if Iran remained friendly, a part of the international community, and therefore in line with international needs. After all, with the Cold War on the horizon, the tensions between the allies were had more potential to become more destabilizing. Am I okay for time? Sorry, I've just sort of lost track a little bit. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
I'm just sort of
Take your
like the
time.
last bits now. Okay. Thank you. Membership to the United Nations saw Iran enter the post-war world with an almost equal position. Its sacrifices for the war effort were thus seen to be rewarded. Iranian diplomats were quick to capitalize on this status, especially within international situations. On a mundane level, they wanted to use that to reestablish its foreign relations. For example, when it came to Iranian interests in Germany after the Nazi government's surrender, they pushed for direct representation as one of the United Nations. However, the months after the war in Europe saw tensions emerge in Iran over the continued presence of the Allied forces. I've already mentioned the Azerbaijan crisis at the start of this paper, but it's worth to spend a little bit time here to just look at it, because in the last months of the occupation, the Soviets actively began to aid and support nationalist groups as a way to prolong their stay in Iran, as part of Stalin's vision for a secure Soviet Union with friendly states at its borders. Directly contradicting the tripartite agreement of 1942, this saw troops remaining in the country even after the war in Europe was over. As a reaction, the British were reluctant to withdraw their own troops, considering the Soviet support of the Azeri and Kurdish nationalist movements, which created anxieties among policymakers in London. Unwilling to negotiate a withdrawal, Iranian sovereignty continued to be suspended while occupying forces remained. The British, with the encouragement of the US, were keen to use the newly created UN to solve this crisis. The ensuing international issue in Azerbaijan saw Iran become one of the first matters brought to the Security Council, with the Iranian government becoming an early participant and case study for how international crisis management worked. Furthermore, the resolution of the crisis was essential to reinforce why the United Nations now as an organization was created and to demonstrate that the trust of these nations had not been misplaced. It seems somehow appropriate that Iran would be one of the first demonstrations of the UN in action and how sovereignty could be safeguarded. Troop withdrawal was eventually finalized and Iran was free of foreign troops by the summer of 46, much to the relief of Iranians and the international community, especially the US, which saw itself as responsible for Iranian freedom. However, in the background, it wasn't the UN per se that guaranteed Soviet withdrawal. It was the promise of a separate oil concession for the Soviets in the north of the country that eventually persuaded Stalin to finally withdraw from the country. Nonetheless, the UN was an important safeguarding body that kept the Soviet Union accountable for its actions in Iran. The principles of the United Nations to safeguard Iranian sovereignty would continue to be something that Iran relied upon in the post-war era. What may come, however, as a surprise is British behavior after 1945. For all its promise of protecting Persian independence, as you saw in the poster, to promoting democracy, as we see here, these were quickly abandoned in light of Britain's post-war reconstruction, its empire, and its position in the emerging Cold War. Although the Conservative Prime Minister Churchill lost the elections in 1945, the Labour government under Clement Attlee saw the reinstatement of imperial policy, with the exception of Palestine and India, which was done in such a haphazard that led to a quick independence and violent partition and displacement. In Iran, as already mentioned, this was focused on British control over the oil and was expanded to labor politics. While intervention was not encouraged, it showed readiness to use military force to protect its oil assets in Abadan in light of the Tudeh threat and showed little concern over international backlash. The oil nationalization crisis in 1951 saw further disruption of British principles when they used the UN and the Security Council to oppose the decision of Mohammad Mossadegh to nationalize the oil. Interceding on behalf of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the British government sought to utilize international bodies to fight the Iranian decision to exercise its sovereign right. Although in the background, plans for a coup d'etat were well underway, the British government under Churchill ironically made a stand against Iranian sovereignty and formalized their disapproval at the Court of International Justice. Iran countered with the argument that neither The Hague or the UN had any jurisdiction on what was essentially a dispute between a sovereign state and a private company. Mossadegh famously went in person to New York to present the Iranian case before the Security Council, emphasizing Iranian sovereignty and its right to nationalize its oil, and accused Britain of escalating the issue into an international crisis by threatening invasion involving the UN. Whipping out its credential as an imperial power, Britain was now acting very differently from the occupation era. The desire to use the UN to prove that Iran was an equal and sovereign nation was thus limited to ensuring that the occupation could appear palatable, and as the oil crisis showed, imperial anxieties and concerns continued to be a driving force for British policy towards Iran. By 1951, promises and questions of sovereignty, such a concern during the war and on the occupation, were replaced by imperial concerns. Much of the idealism of the occupation surrounding membership to the UN was somehow tainted by the realities of British interests. I hope this paper has shown how the UN was an important tool during the occupation of Iran, and that it was essential in guaranteeing Iran's rightful place as a sovereign nation in the post-war world. The idea of Iran as an equal nation was important to maintain and stabilize the occupation and to protect this key concept of sovereignty as a fundamental right, a way to correct the failures of the League of Nations and defend against fascism. For all its worth, it came at a price. Iranian sovereignty, though protected in name, was suspended throughout the war. The occupying forces prioritized wartime needs, exercised control over Iran's foreign affairs and economy. The promise of membership to first the Atlantic Charter and later the United Nations were important tools of coercion and persuasion, a bittersweet pill that was dished out throughout the occupying years. Promises of sovereignty, equality, and importantly, independence, that Britain would protect these rights for Iran. However, while Britain was at the forefront of this during the war, it was unable to fulfill this in the long term. Post-war Britain's needs sustained, and its imperial nature clashed with its earlier promises. The fragile truth was that Iran remained subject to Allied needs and was forced to give up much of its resources under the military occupation during the war, and after was still forced to fight for its sovereignty, especially with regards to oil, even beyond 1945. Thank you for your kind attention, and I very much look forward to your questions or comments. Many thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Jenkins.
Okay, thank you so much, Rowena. That was fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry about the time. I somehow lost my track. I hope that I didn't go too long.
No, you absolutely did not. I find your arguments about the occupation and the war as the necessary context for understanding sort of Iran's relationship, so membership in the UN, relationship to the UN, very convincing. Also the tension in the British position. I know from my own work on this, in the project that we've been doing together on Tehran 1943, where I was looking at the positions of the Americans and the British in Iran during the war, the tension in their relationship as well was quite interesting. So no, this has given me a lot of food for thought. But let's open. I will jump in. I'm sort of still gathering my thoughts for my questions, but I will jump in later. But if we could, Mohammed, is there a way? Oh, maybe I do this. There we go with gallery.
I'll stop sharing my screen, maybe.
No, this is great. So if we'll open the floor to questions, you could put them in the chat if you like, or please just raise your hand or unmute yourself and come into the discussion. Oh, thank you, Professor Tavakoli. The raised hand. Yes, please, your question.
Dr. Abdul Razak, thank you for your fascinating presentation on this really critical and transitional period in Iran's history. What really fascinates me is that how the period of occupation, during the period of occupation, Iranian lawyers and Iranian diplomats used the international tension to enhance Iran's international position and do sort of lift above their weight. And one of the indications personally for me was the election of Nasrullah Intizam as the president of the General Assembly in 1950, and Iran continued to play a key role in the international community, particularly in the UN, for several decades until the revolution of 1979. And the question that I have is that this maneuvering that Iranian politicians and Iranian diplomats did to enhance Iranian sovereignty, because they could have played a different game and Iran could have compromised its sovereignty and it could have become increasingly partitioned, but it didn't.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. Because I think, I mean, I was looking at the war and the occupation as more of a background, but I think it certainly gave, especially balancing the British, the Soviets, and the Americans all throughout the occupation period. I think it gave a lot of Iranian politicians sort of, they were very good at balancing between these occupying powers and trying to ensure that, you know, it still worked, the country still worked. I mean, I can't say much about Iranian diplomats during this period because it seems that a lot of its foreign relations were suspended and that they were not really allowed to, you know, I cannot say much about that, but I think in terms of the maneuvering of Iranian politicians was very much harnessed during the occupation period. And that certainly showed beyond that because they were very good at balancing powers, balancing different needs and strategic needs against the other. I mean, you can see this a lot during the late Pahlavi era as well, and participation in the UN. I mean, even to this day, Iran has played a big role in different arms of the United Nations, whether it's Conference for Women or, you know, or all of that. They're very much an active member. And this is something that I think you already see from the 40s. No, that's an interesting point. It'd be nice to sort of bridge that maneuvering skills.
Yeah, just to follow, what is interesting in 1940s, Iranians with the significance of Atlantic Charter increasingly focus on Cyrus Cylinder as the first declaration of human rights, and then improves Iran's position as the Iranian civilization as the very foundation for sort of a kind of transnational, transconfessional, and multi-ethnic kind of setting. And then later on, Iran used the very same Cyrus Cylinder to argue, called for the establishment for the first conference of human rights in 1968, I think it was. And in a sense, again, Iran played a much more important role, given its own physical location and everything else, in the UN establishment. And that has a lot to do with the intellectual and also legal and political maneuvers that Iranians were able to do. And when you compare it to the past 40 years or so, increasingly Iran has lost that kind of international sort of respect within the international community in the UN that it had in the previous age.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the Cyrus Cylinders, I'm glad you brought that up because I think that was very important and key to the establishment of the UN as well. I mean, the codes are in the UN headquarters. I think there's a replica of it there. So it's very central to some of the key tenets of the UN. And just to echo what you've said, unfortunately, it's lost a lot of its international standing and respect, especially the last couple of years. I mean, even I think just now the United Nations are calling on Iran to hold Iran accountable for what it's doing to its people during these protests. So yeah, it's very essential. That's interesting to see that trajectory as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have some questions, but I don't know if others want to jump in. Because with this occupation period, I'm just thinking of some of the work that, sort of thinking about what your presentation in the context of what I've worked on myself with regard to this time period. There is a lot of tension between the United States and Great Britain and Iran during this period. I mean, the special relationship back then was not so special, was actually quite confrontational. And one of the issues on which the American ambassador Louis Dreyfus was confronting Reader Bullard, Iran, was this question of Iranian independence and Iranian nationalism, where Rowena, does this fit with your research that, and it also has to do with this idea of the third power in Iran, that that the Iranian foreign policy would track toward a third power that would allow it to keep at a distance the demands of both the Russians or the Soviets and the British. And the third power was Germany until about 1911, and when Germany then was removed. This is something that I write about in my own stuff before the First World War. And when Germany is removed, then the Russians can move against the constitutionalists in the north, and with full force and with kind of full military violence. But the third power here during the Second World War is the United States, and there's a lot of tension between the U.S. and the British officials on the question of Iranian independence, which is expressed, at least as I saw it, in the State Department documents about Iranian nationalism, where the British officials were, at least in the documents that I was looking at, quite suspicious toward Iranian nationalism, and often equated Iranian nationalists, called them fascists or called them Nazis as a way to remove them. And so that the U.S. officials had completely different readings of Iranian independence, with the U.S. ironically back then being the more favorable partner for the Iranian national movement. Could you say something about the ways in which British officials, or Reader Bullard in particular, spoke about Iranian nationalists, or also the British used to use the epithet of calling Iranian nationalists fascist sympathizers, Nazi sympathizers, in an effort to discredit them?
I mean, thank you for bringing that up. But I think there was a conflation of nationalism and fascism in a way, because they needed to justify the occupation in some way, an invasion. So they depicted Reza Shah, whether this is accurate or not, as a fascist leader to an extent. And they were very wary of nationalist leaders, because naturally they would have been quite vocal against the occupation itself. So conflating nationalism and fascism was quite a deliberate policy by the British, in order to suppress and ensure that the occupation could run smoothly. But I'm just to go back to what you said about the third power in Iran. I think it's very fascinating, and I think it would be a stretch to say that, in 1941 the US overtook Germany as the third power against the British and the Soviets, but there was certainly an acknowledgement of from the US side and even on the British side, and I think that's why that quote was quite why I picked that quote, and that was that the British were very aware that they had this reputation in the region and Iran, and in Iran, that it had this historical and imperial baggage that it carried to the occupation, and that the US was kind of free from that, even if, just on a superficial level. So there was this acknowledgement that the US was quite useful in did not have that previous role in Iran, and that it was quite useful for the alliance. So it did play this kind of balance between the British and the Soviets, and Roosevelt in particular was quite critical of the empire, of the British Empire, and he certainly wasn't not necessarily a big fan of it. So, so he was quite. So they were quite careful to ensure that Iran didn't fall back into those patterns of British imperial designs. So it kind of took on that role of third power to an extent, in a way that it was able to. It would always advise caution. I mean, this is very clear in the documents. Rita Bullard, the British ambassador during the occupation period, was always quite annoyed when the Americans tried to tell him what to do, not to be too excessive, to remind them that they're just an occupying power, that they need to be careful, not to exercise too much control, too much influence. So it kind of was like an angel on your right or left shoulder, depending on the mood. Sort of like whispering, like advising caution and care. So yeah, so it's interesting on both sides. But there was definitely this conflation of nationalism and fascism, just as much as there was a conflation between United Nations and Alliance. All of these terms were just reduced to something that was easy to utilize as a tool of either coercion or suppression.
I could continue with some questions, but I really do not wish to monopolize, but just what you were saying, you're getting all my thoughts going here. So
good. And it fits with what you do. And I think,
well, I fully agree with you about the importance of this period as kind of critical historical phase in global history, in Iranian history, and sort of a lot of the touch points of your talk I completely agree with. I'm wondering if I could ask you to speak a bit more, give us some more detail on a couple of issues. If I could, Professor Tavakoli, is that okay if I keep?
Yes, please.
Okay. You mentioned, because I'm thinking one of the things that the U.S. and Louis Dreyfus, who is the U.S. ambassador, and Rita Bullard were very different types of diplomats. They also came from different generations. The U.S., Roosevelt was actually very critical with Churchill. These famous statements that the U.S. was not committing blood and treasure to save the British Empire. That was not the aim of the United States in the war. So they clashed quite sharply on these issues. There's a reason why in that famous picture of the big three, as they're called, at the Tehran conference, that Churchill is sitting down a little, that he's not, and also Stalin and Roosevelt, the whole relationship between the two of them, that Churchill was very suspicious of, the fact that it was happening at the Soviet embassy, the meeting, and Churchill his chair was placed a little bit lower. That was all very deliberate and certainly caused all kinds of problems. But a couple of the issues about the occupation that I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned that monetary policy, the way that you said both the U.S., the USSR, the Soviet Union and the UK were very hands-on and would devalue the Iranian currency when it suited their needs. So the ways in which occupying powers were cutting into Iranian sovereignty. If you could say something about that, and then also about the perennial issue about food distribution, that the British were often, or pardon me, the Americans were often criticizing the British officials about the ways in which food distribution in Iran was severely lacking. And certain Iranian figures who, like that, I'm thinking of they clashed over, I'd have to look back in my own notes about Zahedi. And
Fazollah Zahedi.
Huge clash between the two on that. And it had to do with food distribution / food hoarding. And the British and the Americans had very different views. I'm wondering, could you say something about those two issues, the monetary policy? So just give us a flavor of like what was going on there with the devaluing of the currency, and then the food distribution.
Sure. This is because the Iranian sovereignty is not just foreign policy; it's also control over its own policies. So the Iranian, in the case of the devaluation of its currency, it was basically to ensure that it would be able to purchase things like wheat, oil, in particular wheat and oil at a much, much lower cost. So the British and the Soviets would essentially be purchasing these products from Iran, but at a lower cost, which of course doesn't, it would not, that lower cost would not be without the British and the Soviets' direct intervention. So even though the Iranian government was there was an Iranian government, and it in theory could exercise its own policies, it was not allowed to set the price for things like oil and wheat. I must confess that I don't know the exact details of pricing and whatnot, but I do know that that the prices of certain grain, wheat, were deliberately reduced for the purchase by the Allied powers. So there's that, but I do not know much more detail than that. I think there are people who've done much better work on that than I have, but I do know that that was an aspect of the occupation that brought a lot of discomfort and certainly made it more difficult for Iranians to purchase their own products, because this led to inflation, the high cost of living for them. And then with the food distribution, yes, the US and the British actually clashed a lot on Zahedi, especially when it came to his arrest later on. Yeah, so the Americans did not want the British to essentially arrest a citizen of Iran. They thought that it was a violation of Iranian sovereignty and that it took away control and power. But yes, they clashed on food distribution in their own respective zones. The British were very clever, and I say clever, not in the sense that they were very cunning, in the sense that they said nominally that the Iranian government was responsible for food distribution, but in essence this was not true, because the British made sure that a lot of grain and wheat were diverted for in particular Soviet needs. So, but the British would easily and very quickly blamed, oh, don't blame us, blame the government. They're the ones not distributing it correctly. And the US were very upset about this. And at this point, there wasn't so much of a clear policy towards Iran. But I think Louis Dreyfus, I mean, you probably know more than I do, but I know from the British perspective, they found him quite annoying, in the sense that, what's he talking about? What's he doing? We know what we're doing. But yes, and of course with the event, so Zahedi was accused of being one of these pro-German Iranians, Iranian nationalists, pro-German, and they sought to arrest him. And the US were very upset, and it's very clear you can go into the Foreign Office documents and you'll see this, that they very much clashed on that. Yeah.
Yes, no, thank you so much. It's so interesting to think about all of this stuff, because this is also a period when really the tectonic plates in international relations are certainly moving and changing.
Absolutely.
And, also the ways in which, and sorry to keep going on about US policy, but that's the aspect of it. No, in some more in detail. But that also between Roosevelt and Truman, the positions on Iran were very, very different. So U.S. policy itself was quite a great deal between Roosevelt's death and Truman. Policy is shifting in 1947, 48 for various reasons, but between 1943, 1953, U.S. policy on Iran is very, where it is in 1953 is very different, one could argue, from what Roosevelt kind of was envisioning during the war. There are also, as Mohammed was saying, there are all of these Iranian politicians who are they have these fascinating careers with the United Nations, and so in international politics and also in national politics. Mohammed, I'm thinking of Hussein Allah.
Right.
What is he? Is he a player in your story here as well during the war?
For me, Hossein Allah doesn't really. I mean, he's very important, especially from 1946. I mean, he goes to the United Nations, bringing the case of Iran to the Security Council because of the prolonged presence of the Soviet troops in Azerbaijan. He's very key. The British are very encouraging of that. They very much encourage Hossein Allah to use the channel of the UN to counter the Soviets. Although the British remain in the country to balance out the Soviets in Azerbaijan, the British remain in the south. They were very keen to use the UN as a channel to mitigate what the Soviets wanted. So yeah, no, it's quite important, especially towards that later period.
Mm-hmm. You know, this interaction between the international and the national in this period is so interesting. These different platforms on which arguments could be advanced, and also the British position. I mean, this holding on to the empire in quite an embittered fashion. Also, the ways, like I'm very convinced by Mark Mazauer's work on the early history of the UN. His book, there's a short book that he put out a number of years ago called No Enchanted Palace, where we're really looking at the thinking about the UN in the late 30s and early 40s as really a way to save, and it's talked about in this way, a way to save white empire. It's not conceived of initially as a platform for the independence of nations or for decolonization. I mean, what it becomes is very different from these early conceptions, which are about the British kind of doing a kind of defensive maneuver to preserve what, you know, Jan Smuts is a primary figure here. And Jan Smuts from South Africa is definitely talking about white empire, the preservation of white empire, and that the UN would be used for that. And you see this sort of bitter, at least I do with the British, this kind of bitter hanging on, or you know that if the British, you know, if they can't handle it, then it will be passed off to the Americans, but the Americans will potentially follow this same path. I mean, I find that early, like the early history of the UN between 1940. Mazauer goes back into like the intellectual history of the 1930s and early 40s, the time during the war. I find it all quite fascinating because you also get a different view of Britain. I mean, you get a more historically accurate conception of Britain at this period. Less heroic, much more embittered and extremely racist, of course.
Yeah. And this is also, I mean, definitely, and I mean, after the war, they don't really envision freeing all its empire. There's no question of that. And in Iran, I mean, what I try to show is that they are not, that it's still Iran is still in many ways still part of its informal empire. And that it didn't really want to relinquish control over, or which was embodied in its control over the